My name is Glenn Thomas Munsey. My father's name was Charles Austin Munsey, and my mother's name was Minnie Eleanor Munsey. They had 8 children before I was born. I was the last of 9, so naturally I was spoiled and I enjoyed every bit of it. The house that I was born in was in District 5 schoolhouse. It had 4 rooms. There was 4 girls and 4 boys lived in the 1 bedroom. My mother and father lived in the other, and anyone else that happened to be home slept wherever they could find a place to sleep. Minnie Munsey, my mother, was about 4'9" tall. She had a nose as big as mine and a body half as big, so it really seemed big, but it really wasn't a large nose, but on her. And she was a working fool. She worked continuously. She worked in the fields. She worked milking cows along with us kids. And when people would finally shut down for the night to rest, she was still mending clothes. We only had 1 pair of clothes to wear, and we'd have to put on something else, maybe long-handled underwear or whatever we had. But she never left us kids with anything undone. She worked until everything was done. She was probably the kindest mother you could ever want. I always said if there ever was anybody become a saint, she was one of them. So he definitely was a hard-working person and the most honest person. If I'm honest at all, I learned it all from my dad, and I think I am. My dad was really never what I would call a loving dad, but he was the most honest man I ever knew in my life. He bought some lumber for a man to build a barn with, and he went to South Dakota to get that lumber and hauled it out to the guy's farm. And of course, there was no middleman, so he bought it right out of the mill. So when he got there, he told him what he owed him, and the guy wrote him a check, and then he found out that he had overcharged him in what he thought he should be getting by $5. And so he drove back to the guy's ranch, and the guy wouldn't take the $5. And my dad felt so bad about it that he went to the daily newspaper in the town 14 miles from us. Actually, I think we was 6 miles from that town by then. I think we was on our 2nd farm in my lifetime. But anyhow, he put this piece of wood, the technical name of it was lignum vitae. I'll probably remember that till I don't remember anything. But it's one of the harder woods in the world. It was wood that they made bearings for ships out of. In those days they used wooden bearings, and they don't anymore. And he would give $5 to anybody that could name this piece of wood. Well, there was a lot more smarter people than he thought, evidently, because there was 9 people remembered or didn't remember, but figured out the name of that wood. And so he ended up having to pay $45 for that $5 mistake, which he could ill afford, but he did. And his conscience were clean again. It makes me very happy to be able to look after my sister Florence. She probably calls me 4 times a week for help, and I'm able to help her. And my brother Charles and I are probably as close as any brothers. I'm sure we had some rare squabbles, but it didn't carry over too long into our adult life. We got along fine, and I'm proud of those things. And I'm proud that I can still pick up the phone and call my brother and know I'm gonna have a good response at the other end. Well, I wouldn't say I graduated high in my class. When I was in grade school, I always said I was the smartest because I was the only one in my class, which also made me the dumbest. Just a few days after I graduated, I signed up with the U.S. Army. And my father didn't want me to, and I told them that my father wouldn't sign for me, and they said they would just make me older. So I went off in a bus to Fort Warren, Wyoming, and it was over Memorial Day. So I had to do mess cook duty those 3 days, and friend that I went in the service with, I looked at him one of those days and said, I didn't join this army to be a mess cook. I said, I wanted to learn something. And so we both just picked up our little bag and went to town. And we didn't have any money to speak of. We bought a 10-cent loaf of bread each day to eat. And finally we hitchhiked home. And my father, being the father of 3 ex-Navy boys, was glad to sign the Navy papers, and he signed them, and on the 8th of June, I went in the United States Navy.
A night rendezvous inside Wonsan Harbor with a stubborn communist fort. A spectacular display of rocket firepower.
But we were fortunate ourselves. I mean, I seen them, and I had the same amount of fear or non-fear, either way, that anybody else would have had. We were in there to draw fire, and that's what we did. And when we drew fire, the big ships setting further out in the ocean, or in the Yellow Sea actually, just blew them up. The Marines and the Army walked ashore. And I always said that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I had a disciplined place to grow up in, and this was really great. I was seasick half the time when I was in the Navy, but the other half of the time was really great. While I was in the Navy, I was a boilerman, and so I learned how to handle and fire the boilers. The Korean War was still on when I got discharged because I was supposed to get out in 1951, and I got extended a year, and I had fulfilled that year extension and was discharged. And probably 2 years after I was discharged, they started a GI Bill under the Korean War. So I got a little more education under the Korean War. But I was still needing money enough that I worked full-time and went to school half-time. And one of the things that I did. I was never a very good speaker. Just didn't know how to do it. I never had taken it in high school, and so I took public speaking. I took hydrocarbon chemistry as a course. I took another machinist course. All those in, at that time they were junior colleges, now they would be community colleges. So all of that education was really vital to me. It put me in a condition to give you, Pamela, and Roy Lynn, and your mother, Marjorie, a decent living, and it gave me a decent pension. And without all of those, I couldn't have retired when I did, even though your mother needed me at home. I would have had to have worked till I was 65, and then I wouldn't have had a good pension as I have now. Probably the very biggest impact on me was you, Pamela, and your mother. That's probably the biggest impact of all. She had a grievance. We both worked in the same mill, the Longview Fiber paper mill. I was on the grievance committee there, and she came to the union meeting and wanted to know who Glen Munsey was. And they pointed me out to her, and she told me her tales of woe. She had gotten fired. She felt unjustly, and I told her I would take care of it and see if I couldn't get her job back, which the next day I met with the company, and after our discussions and ideas of right and wrong were discussed, they give her job back, and she still worked there. I never went with her at that time. Came back to Longview to be hailed as one of the people that should have a trophy for their actions in the labor unions, and to bring a guest. I thought, who do I know? And then maybe I know somebody, and I called your mother. So I picked her up and we went, and after that was over, a couple of friends of mine, a man and a wife, John and Janice Bade, you probably remember that name, went out to Chinese food. Then I went out with her the next night, and she had you with her. And we've been in love with each other ever since, you and I. And anyhow, we dated a couple, 3 more weekends, and I asked her if she would marry me. And she accepted, and we got married in the Lutheran church in Longview, Washington. Went on a honeymoon for 2 days, came back and picked up a trailer and her car with the trailer hooked up to it, and her being your mother. And I had a Volkswagen that I had some friends of mine drive back with just married signs on and everything, and it was 2 men riding down the road, which was rather humorous, but they took my Volkswagen back to the Tri-Cities where I lived, about 10, 12 miles from actually where I lived, and I had rented a house, actually it was an apartment for us to live in. So that's how your mother and I became man and wife. Year later, actually it would be a year and a couple of months later, because your sister Roylynn was born in the same month of December, one of you being December 13th, which would be you, Pamela, and Roylynn was born on December 22nd. Your mother and I bought a house in the Tri-Cities then. It was, I can't remember what they called them. They were government houses. And it had one bedroom in it. And we were on strike where we was at. So I left for a construction job and took you and your mother and your sister to Tacoma to live, still keeping that house for a period of time. And during that first year that we lived in Tacoma, then we moved to up by Everett, Washington, to an apartment there, and finally to Longview, Washington, and necessary if we wanted to work. And you went to school in 5 different schools that year. But from that time on, we bought a house in Kelso and remodeled it. And during our remodeling, we added a new bathroom and a bedroom on it, so that we all had a room of our own to sleep in. We lived in that house until, I don't know how long. By that time, I had become the business manager of the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union, Local 695. It was situated in Longview, Washington, and we built a new house with a swimming pool on Kelview Drive, and we built it big enough that it had 3 bedrooms in it already, where you finished your high school. But from that time on, I didn't work at the pipe fitting trade anymore. I worked as their business manager for the union. And then I was hired as an organizer for the whole state of Oregon. And I worked 2.5 more years there. And by that time, I was 88 years old, and your mother was quite ill. I'm 58 years old. I'm glad you looked at me. 58 years old, and your mother was quite ill. So I retired. I took 2 other jobs and worked at them then, where I could be around home until I was 75. But things that I would sooner do than anything else I've done in my life is play bridge. I'm not as good a bridge player as I used to be, but for 17 years in this bridge club, I had high score. That's what I would sooner do. But if you was just to ask me, what do you want to do tonight? But as far as things that could make me happier would be around my children and my grandchildren, being able to help my wife through her surgeries and through regular life. She's very important to me, even though I growl at her. And I'm sure I'm as equally important to her, even though she growls at me. My wife, Marjorie, loves her kids, loves her husband, loves her grandkids. She would love to dote on them, and does to quite a degree. There's never been a thing done on our houses that she hasn't been my right-hand man. Anytime I needed help, she was there to do it. When we dug the basement, she helped dig the basement. When we poured the walls for the basement, she run the tamper for the forms. When I built the story on top of the house, she helped me every time I needed help. She always had food on the table for me, unless she wanted to eat out. And no, I think probably I get as excited when things don't go right as any husband does, but she's the best thing that happened to me. And I can say that unequivocally. I love both of my daughters equally, but for totally different reasons, I guess would be the more way to describe it. Raising my two children, that keeps circling back to me. Knowing that they both love me and they would both do anything they possibly could for me, even if they don't need to. It's very enriching, very satisfying. Knowing that the things that I have done have affected the way my grandchildren think of me. I think I've been a good grandpa, and I think that they think so. And if they don't, I'll never know it, because they really show a lot of affection for me. That's something that we didn't see in our growing up, probably because it just was too tough to do anything except work. But nevertheless, it's things I've done and things that my wife has done, and it's came back to roost on both of us as good.